Hello, my name is Sol Soler. I'm the philosopher and theoretical physicist that has written the principles of the physics of consciousness. And in my last lecture, which is titled the solution to the hard problem of consciousness, I read through my formal statement of the principles of consciousness, and also whilst I was reading through it, I commented on it and expanded discussed each of the principles as I went through it, explaining them and justifying them. So I've been presenting my theory and my principles for quite a long time now, a few months at least. That's involved me, it's been quite an active co-creation between me and people on Reddit, in the sense that I would present my theories and my ideas in particular ways, and then people would ask questions or make objections, and then I would try and make the ideas and the principles more and more clear. And now I think in my formal statement, I put them very clearly, and I explained them in the last lecture. So in this lecture, I'm going to address a few of the most common objections, because I get the same objections over and over again as I present this to different people. Because I've presented it to a lot of people, a lot of scientists, and yeah, the objections are always the same. So if you've listened to the previous lecture, the previous lecture is called The Solution to the Hard Problem of Consciousness, where I state and explain the principles of the physics of consciousness. If you've listened to that, you might have some objections to the theory and the principles, which is very likely. Most people I present it to don't immediately accept it, because it's very revolutionary. It's a very new way of conceiving of the universe that you live in. But the objections are all the same, and they're all, at least at this stage, very easy for me to refute, because I've refuted them so many times. So I have some comments here that people have made on some of my posts online, and I'll read those. They exemplify some of the most common objections, and yes, a friend online sent me a list of his objections, and then a few other people have commented with objections. And yeah, these exemplify the most common objections to my theory and my principles. So I'll read these out and discuss them and explain in what ways they are not valid objections. And in doing so, hopefully that will clear up any objections or doubts that you had if you listened to the previous lecture, and it'll also help make the principles even clearer. Okay. So basically, I think the main objection is actually psychological, personally. That's the impression I get. The main objection is psychological and not logical or scientific. No one presents any logical or scientific, valid logical or scientific objections. I present the theory to scientists, they present some objections, I then refute the objections, and then they just start ignoring me. Then they go totally silent. So yeah, the objections tend not to be logical or scientific, really. So I think it's more psychological. I think it requires a very significant reconceptualization of your existence, because you're human, physical and conscious human, and you exist within this universe out of which you've been born, in the sense that the whole, we are made out of this universe. You are a subset of the stuff of this universe. You're formed out of the most basic elementary stuff of this universe, and you're embedded in this universe. And so you have your conceptions of what you are, and also very important and intimately related to those conceptions are your conceptions of the universe that you live in. And those conceptions are your conceptions of reality. So for you to believe this theory, or even well, first you have to find it plausible. Once you find it plausible, then it will be in your mind, and then you'll start applying it to the world around you, and then you'll see, oh wow, it really explains so much. And then the fact that it explains so much is what will convince you that it's true. So one thing is to remember that physics is not an exact science, and nothing can ever be proven by a human beyond doubt about this universe. Which makes sense, because look at the size of the universe and look at its complexity, its immensity, and complexity, and then look at the size of your brain, and we can't even explain our own brains, let alone our brains and the whole universe that they're embedded in. So yeah, the point being that physics is an approximate, never exact description of our universe. And it's also not a certain description of our universe. So all physics is approximate, and it's always liable to being made more accurate. I'll give you an example. I've given this example before. The Newtonian theory of gravity, Isaac Newton's theory of gravity and his law of gravitation, is an approximation only to the more accurate theory developed by Einstein called general relativity. That gives a much more accurate and expansive description of the nature of gravity in our universe. But Isaac Newton's theory is a very good approximation. It holds true in a lot of, for a wide range of gravitational phenomena. You can use Newton's theory and you'll make very accurate descriptions and predictions of gravitational dynamics. For example, NASA landed on the moon without using any general relativity whatsoever. Newton's theory of gravity was accurate enough for us to land, for Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to land on the moon, as Michael Collins kept the motor running up above them. But so yeah, Newton's law of gravity isn't really an exact law of this universe. It's an approximation to the nature of our universe. And you have to study general relativity if you want to know a more exact approximation. But even general relativity is an approximation. It's just a mathematical description. And a very accurate mathematical description that will have to be updated as well. My point being, all our physics, at least to date, is provisional and is all liable to be updated. For example, at the moment, general relativity is not compatible with quantum mechanics. I think that will change soon enough. And so general relativity will be an approximation to the new theory of gravity that is compatible with quantum mechanics. So, so as I say, I think the main objection to this theory isn't any logical or scientific problem. It's a psychological issue of being able to find this significant change in how you conceive of your universe, being able to find it plausible first. But then once you find it plausible, you start applying it to the world around you and you'll see its explanatory power, and that's what will actually make you believe it's true. Okay? So that's how it worked with Newton's theory. Newtonian mechanics, his principles and his laws, they allow for models to be constructed that are accurate, and they can be constructed over a wide range of phenomena, which makes us go, okay, this description of the universe seems universally applicable, so therefore it's a good description of our universe, so we trust it and believe it. Even though, as general relativity and quantum mechanics prove, it wasn't the exact, it's not an exact and totally true description of our universe. Okay, what is the reconceptualization that you have to be able to achieve? Well, for centuries now, the basic energy and matter of our universe has been considered totally devoid of any consciousness. That is, atoms and particles and energy, basic energy, weren't supposed to be conscious at all, which means that things like rocks and bricks aren't conscious at all. So now you have to shift from that way of, and then human consciousness is supposed to just emerge somehow non-conscious energy and particles combine together such that consciousness switches on. But of course, as we all know, there's no remotely sensible theory as to how this happens, which is the big problem, and one of the biggest clues that we know to knowing that assumption is wrong is that we can't build any sensible theory that aligns with our experience or that explains any conscious experience. So you have to go from believing that all the stuff around you is totally devoid of consciousness to conceiving of yourself within a universe that is entirely conscious everywhere. It's formed out of nothing, because it's undeniable scientific fact that all the energy of our everything in our universe is formed out of energy. That's undeniable scientific fact. Like that's basically the basic premise of science, or one of the most basic premises of science. Everything's formed out of energy. And this energy has been believed to be non-conscious for centuries. And that's how we're taught about it in school. You know, consciousness is never ever mentioned in relation to atoms and particles. And actually, if it is ever mentioned in relation to atoms and particles and things like that, well then scientists immediately say that's woo-woo, that's bullshit, that's rubbish, that's not science, that's spiritual nonsense. Okay, so there's actually a great prejudice against this idea that all the energy might be conscious. But it just explains too much not to be true, as I've been showing. So yeah, I think at root, that's the real issue. But then there are some more technical objections that have been brought up, because if you study my lectures and study the essays that I've published, you know, there is no other theory that explains this broad a range of phenomena so simply and intuitively. I mean, there's still huge amounts of work to be done. Remember, Newtonian physics wouldn't be considered complete until 300 years after Isaac Newton. So, yeah, that's the main issue. So like I get a comment like, you claim that consciousness existed at t equals 0 when the Big Bang happened, and it is equivalent to energy existing in all things, just like the Force in Star Wars. Okay, so, you know, I get a lot of just reflexive comment, because this is part of a string of comments where the person is trying to make fun of me, basically, a little bit. I mean, in a perfectly nice and friendly way. He's not insulting me or anything. I'm just talking about, this is a common reaction of, don't be, like, it's just someone kind of saying to me, don't be so ridiculous. All energy isn't conscious. That's kind of the immediate, don't be so ridiculous. All energy isn't conscious. That can't be. But it really can be. Or people say, that's not science. That's not a scientific idea or a scientific possibility. Well, it is a scientific possibility. So the first objection would be, oh, that's not real science. That's not a scientific possibility. So that's the first prejudice you have to clear from your mind, because it just plain and simply is a scientific possibility. And it's provably a scientific possibility. You're formed out of energy and particles, and you're conscious. And as we scan the brain, it seems to be that every change in consciousness, every change in your conscious state corresponds with a change in your physical state. That is, in the physical configuration of the particles and energy forming your body. Like, there seems to be a direct correlation between the configuration, the physical and energetic configuration of your body and your conscious states. And neurology is mapping, because there's not just a correlation, there's a reliable and consistent correlation when you are consciously seeing something, certain well-defined parts of the brain light up every time you're every time you experience visual consciousness, and every time you have auditory consciousness, it's another specific part of the brain lights up. Like there is this correlation between our physical forms and our conscious state. So there's nothing unscientific whatsoever in the idea that all energy possesses consciousness intrinsic within itself, and our configurations of these conscious energy and particles that are our bodies and brains, we are experiencing the consciousness within those energy and particles. And they come into complex configurations such as the human body and a human brain, and that gives rise to our very complex conscious experience. There are two logical and scientific possibilities. It's good to get down to the very basics and deal with undeniable scientific facts, what science has shown beyond all doubt. And what science has shown beyond all doubt is that everything that has physical existence in this universe is formed out of physical energy. Energy can form into particles, and it can turn back into energy. So everything is formed out of the basic energy that was created in the Big Bang. That's just one of the most basic scientific facts. Undeniable. And then we are formed out of only that. And there's nothing else exists. Literally nothing else exists. Everything that you examine or touch or look at in this universe is formed out of energy. And there is nothing else. And then so all the phenomena of this energy, of this universe, have their basis in energy. So consciousness is a phenomena of this universe. So it's perfectly reasonable and scientific to say that consciousness has its basis in energy as well. And then there are basically two logical and scientific postulates. One is that the basic energy is non-conscious, and then it forms non-conscious particles out of itself, and then these particles come together into more complex formations, configurations, and then consciousness switches on discontinuously. It has to discontinue. If the energy and particles are non-conscious, then consciousness has to at some point discontinuously switch on. And for 100 years, there's been a total failure to explain how this switching on takes place. And there's been a total failure of observing any consciousness. We haven't observed any other phenomena. Like all we see is energy, particles, neurons, microtubules, whatever. And there's been this wild goose chase. Oh, consciousness is in neurons. Then we go and look at the neurons, and no, they just act like energy and particles, because that's what they're made out of. There's like networks of neurons, and then we're like, okay, well, we look at networks of neurons, and they just look like energy and particles, They just look like physical neurons, manifesting like physical energy does when you view it objectively. And okay, no, it's not neurons, it's in the microtubules. Then we go and look in the microtubules. And again, we just see physical energy manifesting as in different, in the formation of a microtubule. So now most recently I saw, consciousness is in rectilinear formations in the brain. And I can absolutely guarantee you that they will go and study these rectilinear formations, waste a huge amount of money researching them, and they will not see consciousness there. They will just see energy and particles. Or they say, consciousness is in the electromagnetic field of the brain. But then they have no possible explanation of saying how does energy, once it becomes an electric field around the brain, how does the consciousness turn on in that electric field? And why not the magnetic field, or why not the gravitational? A brain has a gravitational field as well, and a magnetic field. Why isn't the consciousness in them? And the thing is, you'll never be able to prove it, because if you look at, we're only able to view things objectively. We're only able to view electric fields objectively, and we won't see any consciousness there. We'll just see electric fields, and there's no possibility of making a theory out of ideas like that. Equivalent to energy existing in all things. Yeah, so that's one possibility, is that energy switches, consciousness switches on around non-conscious energy and particles. And then there just is another logical and scientific possibility, which is that consciousness is intrinsic, is an intrinsic property of all energy. That energy is consciousness. And that all energy experiences some subjective consciousness within itself. And this subjective conscious experience changes depending on the form that the energy is in. Okay? That it just is scientific. How do we know it's correct? Well, because we can actually make a theory and a physics of consciousness that lines up with all our empirical observations of consciousness. That is, it lines up with all of neurology. It also explains the experiments of quantum mechanics. It also lines up with our subjective everyday experience of being physical conscious entities. So that's basically from a strictly scientific point of view, I've proved this beyond all doubt. Beyond all reasonable scientific doubt, I've theoretically proven that this is the solution to the hard problem of consciousness. Now, one thing that people keep on saying is, oh, you need testable hypotheses, you need experiments, and that's true. I do need experiments, and any new theory should provide new experiments. And I do have those experiments. I'm just waiting for my theory to get some attention. I think I'm going to give a few more lectures, and then maybe 2 or 3 lectures from now, I'll give a full lecture on experimental proof. That is, new testable hypotheses, new experiments that we can do to show that to empirically prove my theory. So I've theoretically proven my theory, and then we can use experiments to empirically prove my theory. What I should say here is, another thing that we've got to bear in mind is that when there's theory and there's experiments. And experiments prove theories true. And theories make sense of experiments. But the order isn't always the same. It's not always theory, then experiments. Sometimes the experiments come first, and then the theory explains them afterwards. Okay, and sometimes it's both. Sometimes there are some experiments beforehand, then the theory, and then the theory creates new experiments. So it's not always theory, then experiments. So one example of that is special relativity. The experiments of special relativity were actually done before Einstein came up with his theory. What Einstein's theory of special relativity that he released when he released it in 1905, what that theory did and why it was accepted as correct was because it explained experiments that had already been carried out, particularly the Fizeau experiment. Excuse my French pronunciation there, and the Michelson-Morley experiment. So those 2 experiments were done before Einstein. It was the equations that solving these, making sense of these experiments were even known, and it was known that these equations made sense of the experiments. What Einstein did was give the correct interpretation and correct metaphysical derivation of these equations. So in that case, the experiments were done beforehand. And in my case, a lot of the experiments have been done beforehand. All the experiments of neuroscience align with my theory and therefore corroborate my theory, and all the experiments of quantum mechanics align with my theory. So as I mentioned in my previous lecture, the mysteries of consciousness and the mysteries of quantum mechanics they're twin mysteries, and once you solve one, you solve the other. And that, as I say, that puts it beyond all reasonable doubt. The fact that postulating intrinsic consciousness both allows for a physics of consciousness to be constructed and gives the first simple, logical and intuitive interpretation of the experiments of quantum mechanics already experimentally proves my theory beyond all doubt. But people want new experiments. People keep on saying, you need new experiments, which I fully understand. And I do have new experiments. I have a number of new experiments, and I'll dedicate a whole essay to those things, to those experiments. But I did want to, I want my theory to be out in the zeitgeist, and it should be out, it deserves to be out in the zeitgeist, because it's the first ever a theoretical solution to the hard problem of consciousness. So, you don't have to believe that the theory is actually the case you don't have to believe that that's how our universe actually is, but it is provably a scientific theory, and it does logically and scientifically solve the hard problem of consciousness, which means that scientists studying consciousness and neurologists, neuroscientists, and old physicists should pay huge attention to it, because it's the first time in 100 years that there's a logical, simple, theoretical solution to the hard problem of consciousness, and it also gives the correct interpretation of the experiments of quantum mechanics. And I'm working on the derivations of the equations of special relativity, but it's just, I haven't quite worked those out yet. But yeah, so I often get told, oh, this isn't science. No, it definitely is science. This definitely is valid theoretical physics. And I am a theoretical physicist. Fine, I'm not, I studied an undergrad in theoretical physics. I didn't do a master's or PhD. I left college and went traveling and studied philosophy. But I was trained as a theoretical physicist and very rigorously in a very good university. So it is valid theoretical physics, and it's the first time anyone has theoretically and scientifically solved the hard problem of consciousness. So that's huge. But I'm being ignored, if not suppressed. Well, it's difficult to get attention on these things. I've been finding. I didn't think it would be so difficult to get attention on an actual valid solution of the hard problem. I thought that would be pretty big news. But yeah, I think that has to do with psychology more than anything. People are invested in their own theories. Like, I present this to people, scientists, and some of them don't want it to be true because, well, it means that their theory, that they're professional, they're professional scientists of consciousness with their own theories of consciousness. That obviously they want their own theory to be true. And my theory shows that their theories aren't true. So there's that reason. And then, the reconceptualization of the universe. Like, it is shocking. It's shocking to realize that the whole universe has been conscious and alive since the beginning of time, since t equals 0, the Big Bang. The Big Bang, all the energy in that first state of our universe, it had physical properties, and it also had, and consciousness was one of those properties. And that first state was also a conscious state. That's shocking. But the whole universe, we've until now, if you're a scientist, you've believed that the universe was this cold, dead nothingness, like that, just this physical clockwork of stars and planets and orbits and things like that, and like supernovas and things like that, with no experience of itself, which is very strange. I mean, that's illogical for a start, because the universe has been existing for 10 billion years before life is supposed to have, been able to begin on planets, without any experience, which is equivalent to non-existence. So that's very strange. So I personally think it makes a lot more sense if the universe has always been having experience. It's just those experiences are very different. So that's one of the big issues, is to realizing that there are many, many different types of conscious experience. Okay, and you can verify that from your own life. There's the conscious experience of being when you wake up in the morning and you're half asleep and you're half dreaming, compared to the experience when you're in deep sleep. We have very, very, very dim consciousness that's almost imperceptible, such that you could say you're not conscious at all, to the consciousness of when you're fully alert, you're on a roller coaster, for example, adrenaline is pumping through your body, or when you take drugs and you're hallucinating. There's a very wide range of human consciousness. And then we can look at plants and animals around us that we believe to be conscious, and we can look at them and look at the way they behave and the way they're constructed and be like, well, their consciousness must be very, very different than ours as well. Like, watch an ant for some time. I mean, look at an ant's eyes. We can work out things about ants' consciousness. We can look at their eyes. We can see at what wavelengths they see. We can work out, what type of range of vision they have, what colors they see, and and their vision is very much different to human vision because their eyes are constructed so differently. So, and we can just observe them and how small they are, and their brains are very, very tiny, so they must have much less complex conscious experience, and we can watch how they live and verify that they have much less complex experience because their lives are so simple. Their activities are so simple. Whereas humans have much more complex conscious experience because we can read and study and philosophize and talk and enjoy music and etc., etc. Whereas an ant's life is limited to very few activities. Okay. My point being that at first thought, it might strike you as ridiculous that the energy born in the Big Bang was conscious. But we're not saying conscious in a kind of human, personal way with any ego. It could have just been one pure, first off, that state was a totally homogenized state, and all the energy was crammed into one point, one infinitesimally small point. Okay, and it was totally undifferentiated and homogenized. So we can say some things about the first conscious state, like we can say that the energy, that the first conscious state was one consciousness. Now that energy has expanded and differentiated and has evolved into a large number of different individual conscious states, including my conscious state and your conscious state. So it's expanded into different physical objects and into different physical separate conscious states. So yeah, it is shocking and it is revolutionary to go from thinking that all the energy was non-conscious and that the only consciousness is human consciousness and that just switched on somehow, to wow, it's all been conscious for the whole 14 billion years and it's been having all sorts of different conscious experiences. It's been having the conscious experience of humans, the conscious experience of a snake, the conscious experience of a tree, a fungi, the conscious experience of the bacteria in your stomach, the conscious experience of the sea, the conscious experience of stars. All stars must be having some conscious experience. This isn't to say that they have any ego or like, hey, I'm a star. It doesn't mean that they have any spiritual, properties at all, or any sense of spirituality, but they just have some conscious experience, whatever that may be. We can't say what that is yet. But the future of the physics of consciousness, we might start, or I believe we will start eventually, could take hundreds of years to be able to deduce what types of conscious states entities like stars have. But yeah, I can understand how at first that takes some getting used to. It is a big shock. And again, I always refer back to the Copernican revolution. People had to go from believing that the Earth was at the center of the solar system, that us humans were here on Earth, were at the center of the solar system, to just third rock from the sun, when the sun was at the center. That's a dramatic reconceptualization of your universe. And this one is, I think, probably even more dramatic than that. Everything around you is dead to everything around you is conscious. It doesn't mean at all that you have to worry about your chair being conscious. Not at all. It's not like a Disney movie. It's not like Beauty and the Beast where the cups and the candlesticks have personalities. Not at all. A chair is a very, very simply configured collection of conscious energy and particles. Therefore, it has exceedingly simple consciousness. Like it might feel temperature, and it has no central nervous system. So it doesn't have a center of consciousness. It has no one point like you do. You experience things at a center. It doesn't have that because it doesn't have a central nervous system. So all we're saying is that each of the atoms within the chair, each of them are a center of consciousness, experiencing whatever they experience within themselves as they are a chair. So a chair is a very large number of atoms bound together. Okay, and each of those atoms in its nucleus has a center of consciousness, and that nucleus is experiencing whatever it's experiencing. That would be very simple consciousness. such as consciousness of temperature, consciousness of motion, consciousness of forces, consciousness of pressure. It just experiences things like that. It definitely is not like, hey, I'm an atom and I'm in a chair, and the chair has no sort of sense of I'm a chair. We're not saying anything crazy like that. We're just saying that the decisions that we once thought were made probabilistically, because that's what quantum mechanics says, that like whether an atom falls from one energy level to a lower energy level, something like that, that's a selection of a new quantum state. Previously, that's been thought to have been made probabilistically, and now we're just saying no. The atom is a very simple conscious thing, and it chooses when to jump down energy level. That's just part of its nature. Okay, and then these you can get more and more complex configurations until you have things like cells and amoebas, all the way up to the complexity of a human. Okay, and we've got to be careful of anthropocentrism. Because, humans were shocked that, the Earth isn't at the center. Before Copernicus, why did the humans assume that the Earth was at the center? Well, because that's where we are. We experience the Earth as the center of our experience. The Earth is the center of all humans' experience. And so, therefore, when we make a model of the universe, we naturally put the Earth at the center. But it's wrong. The sun is at the center. So that's called anthropocentrism. And with consciousness too, there's anthropocentrism, which is the only consciousness any of us directly experiences is our own, and that's human consciousness. So we struggle to imagine consciousness existing that's very different from ours. Okay, that's why for a long time there were scientists who doubted that animals were conscious. Even dogs and elephants and things like that. Scientists said, oh no, they're not conscious. They're automatons. They're just like robots or zombies. And they have no consciousness like we do. That's anthropocentrism. It's because we just only experience, our understanding of consciousness is only via human consciousness. So we have a tendency to assume that's the only consciousness that exists. But no, there are as many, and this is a key point, there are as many types of conscious experience as there are different physical objects in the universe. Okay, so yeah. We're not saying your chair has a personality. You're not saying your chair is a singular conscious entity. We're just saying that the atoms that it's made of, each of them are conscious and they're bound together physico-consciously. And they just have conscious experience of the physical processes involved in being a chair or being in the formation of a chair. And the quantum decisions that were once thought to be made probabilistically are actually being made by the innate, intrinsic consciousness of the particles themselves. And of course, it's perfectly logical to suppose that particles have intrinsic consciousness because we're made out of particles and energy, and we are intrinsically conscious. So actually the best and simplest explanation of that is that the particles have intrinsic consciousness and they combine together into more complex forms. So I just got to answer the door. One, bear with me. And we are okay. And here locally on Earth, we are the most complex formations of conscious energy and particles, and therefore we have the most complex conscious experience. Which again it's the theory is shocking and revolutionary, but it's not unscientific or illogical. Okay, so yeah, that's just the psychological shock, the reconceptualization of the universe as a very gigantic sphere of interconnected consciousness. Okay, but it's worth taking the time to find that plausible because it explains so much and makes sense of, allows us to start making sense of so much more of the universe. With conventional physics, all we could do was make sense of how things move through space, basically, and how things form together into objects. Now we can start systematically studying the conscious experience within things and make sense of our own, more sense of our own physico-conscious natures. Okay? So what else did I want to say? So what are the... Okay, yeah. Then there was... Let me have a look here. Okay. So let's have a look at another comment. Someone says, this doesn't sound revolutionary at all. How is it any different than property dualism? Okay, so then I wrote, I'll just read what I wrote back in response to that. I wrote, it's revolutionary because whilst many panpsychic theories of consciousness have been suggested in philosophy, this is the first time such a theory has been put on a firm scientific basis, employing simple, well-defined scientific laws and principles that can be used for an expandable and teachable physics of consciousness, just like Newton's laws and principles have been used in the analysis of macroscopic objective dynamics. Okay, so yeah, as I keep repeating, we can tell my theory is correct because it works in analogy to Newton's theory. Also, these principles allow for the first simple theoretical models of conscious systems to be constructed, and the postulate of intrinsic consciousness allows for the first simple logical and intuitive interpretation of the experiments of quantum mechanics, which really puts it beyond reasonable scientific doubt. Okay, then in response to that, he says, okay, and I say actually, for centuries the scientific establishment has assumed that the basic energy and particles of our universe are non-conscious. So for a genuinely scientific theory to show otherwise will make for a scientific revolution. And yeah, these principles will once they are finally make it into the zeitgeist properly, will make for a scientific renaissance. And one reason why I'm eager for these principles to make it into the zeitgeist is because they have very profound medical consequences. Just think of the placebo effect and how immediately my theory makes sense of the placebo effect, where your thoughts and beliefs, which are in your brain, can have an influence on the rest of your body outside of your brain, but connected to your brain, based on your thoughts and beliefs. As in, if you believe a pill is actually medicine, a sugar pill is medicine, it can help cure you of certain diseases. Immediately that makes sense with my theory, because all energy is conscious, all particles are conscious, and your body is physico-consciously connected to your brain, and therefore the thoughts that you have in your brain, they are dependent on the physical configuration of your brain, and they are physically and consciously connected to the rest of your body, which is why your thoughts have influence over the health and physical state of your body, because it's all connected consciousness. Okay, so that's why I think it is important for me to start getting some attention, because there's a lot of important medical research and theory to be carried out. Okay, so this guy then says, I hear you. I like this idea you're going for, but I still have some questions. Let's say that this is true. Physical energy has the intrinsic property of consciousness. How would you prove that? And he says, what I'm implying is that this theory is trying to find the consciousness correlates in physics. If successful, that's amazing. However, in order for us to prove that physical energy has intrinsic property of consciousness, we still need some sort of causal model for something to have an experience. So then I respond, here we must make sure we understand the law of privacy and its logical and scientific consequences. This law states that the only way to directly observe any subjective conscious experience is to be the physical object within which the experience is being experienced. All of empirical investigation of consciousness testifies to this law, as well as all of our personal experience of consciousness. We've examined the brain on all scales, and we only ever see the objective manifestations of physical energy, such as grey matter, neurons, and particles, etc. We can never see the subjective conscious experience that the patient is directly experiencing subjectively within their brain. Why? Because we are observing their brain from without, and the experience is within the energy of the brain, because physical energy is physical consciousness. So yeah, whenever we look at any consciousness apart from our own, we're looking at it from without. And then it always appears as energy, as objectively observed energy, as we observe it, in conventional objective science. The only subjective consciousness we can ever experience or directly observe is our own, because it happens within, it is the energy, so it's only experienced by the energy. Like your conscious state is the energy that forms you. All that energy is conscious, but it's only experienced by itself. And then you can look at another person who's experienced the consciousness, that they are a formation of physical conscious energy as well, and they're experiencing that consciousness within themselves, but you can only look at that from without, so you can only view them objectively, and you can never see their conscious experience, and that explains the law of privacy. And that explains why we have concepts in philosophy such as solipsism, which is the idea that maybe yours is the only consciousness that exists, and there's no way of objectively proving that that isn't the case. Okay. So we have examined the brain on all scales, and we only ever see the objective manifestations of physical energy, such as grey matter, neurons, and particles, etc. We can never see the subjective conscious experience that the patient is directly experiencing subjectively within their brain. Why? Because we are observing their brain from without. Okay, I read that twice. Also, from your own experience, you know that the only subjective conscious experience you have ever experienced is your own. You believe your family and friends are conscious, not because you have ever directly observed their conscious experience, but rather because you objectively observe their behaviors, and these behaviors convince you that they are conscious in a way similar to yourself. So this means that we will never objectively observe or measure subjective conscious experience. The subjective aspects of consciousness are purely subjective and cannot be observed objectively. Okay, so scientists want an objective treatment of consciousness. But you can't do that because it's not a purely objective phenomenon. It has irreducibly subjective aspects. And that's why my scientific definition of consciousness is the correct one, because it's the only one with a subjective component. And so people say, oh, you're saying an electron is conscious, for example, but you can't prove that it's conscious. Well, you can't prove that anything is conscious. We just have to, as philosophers, as scientists, we have to accept the facts of the case of our universe. And the facts of the case of our universe are that you cannot objectively observe subjective conscious experience. So we will never objectively prove that anything is conscious. Not a human, not an electron, nothing. But we will also never objectively prove that anything is not conscious. So you can't examine a human, investigate them objectively and scientifically, and prove that they're not conscious. You just look at them and they act conscious. And you're like, okay, and a human is a similar formation as you, so their behavior is, their conscious experience is similar to yours, so their behavior is similar to yours. You're like, yeah, judging by their behavior, I can empathize with their behavior, and therefore I assume that they're conscious in a similar way that I am. So no, we can't objectively prove that an electron is conscious, but we also can't objectively prove that it's not conscious either. So we have those two possibilities. It either is intrinsically conscious or it's not intrinsically conscious. We'll never objectively prove beyond all doubt either of those two things. So how do we decide between those two possibilities? By seeing which one makes a sensible theory that aligns with our empirical investigation of consciousness as well as our experience of consciousness. And only one of the postulates does allow for a theory and a physics to be constructed, and that's that all energy is intrinsically conscious. And the primary piece of evidence for that is that that's the only way to, or that allows us to give a clear, simple, logical, and intuitive interpretation of the experiments of quantum mechanics. Like that's the strongest piece of evidence for my theory. is that not only does it make sense of our conscious experience and allow us to construct conscious models or models of conscious systems, but it's the first time the experiments of quantum mechanics have been given a simple, logical, intuitive interpretation that anyone can understand. Like, here's the remarkable thing about my theory, because you listen to other theories of consciousness, and you can't make head nor tail of them. They're just not simple. They have no principles. You can't use them to make models, and you couldn't explain them to someone. They don't make another person go, when you explain them to a lay person, it doesn't make the lay person go, oh, okay, yeah, I understand. Whereas my theory does just immediately make sense. All the energy is conscious within itself, and it comes into different forms and has different conscious experience, which is why you have consciousness throughout your entire body, and why purely physical things like light and chemicals affect and alter your conscious state. Okay, I've explained it a lot. Okay, I think I'll leave it there, basically. So I was just trying, I rambled a lot and didn't say a lot of what I wanted to say, and didn't address a lot of the objections that I wanted to address, because I was rambling, as usual. Anyway, oh well. Probably shouldn't have drank that coffee. But yeah, I don't want this lecture to be very long. So what do I say here? So we will never objectively prove that a photon or an electron is conscious, because their consciousness takes place subjectively within them, and we can only view them objectively from without. So yeah, conventional physics is the objective observation of energy. So all energy is conscious, and then we can view it objectively, and that's what conventional science is. And now what I'm doing is expanding, because all physics works by expansion. So what I'm doing is expanding physics so that it can start systematically studying and analyzing the subjective aspects of energy. So physical energy came into existence with its various properties, and this energy can be experienced objectively, that is from without. So that's when you look at something that isn't you, you're looking at the outside of it, like another human or something, then you're viewing them objectively, and you can experience them like that. That's an experience of energy, because they're formed out of energy. And so that's one way of experiencing the energy of this universe, objectively. But energy can also be experienced subjectively. But here's the thing, when energy is experienced subjectively, it's only experienced by the object itself within itself. So you can look at another human, you're viewing them objectively, and you're experiencing their formation of energy objectively. But they are experiencing that same formation of energy subjectively, because they are that formation of energy. But that can only be experienced within the object itself, by the object itself. Okay? It's experienced differently when it's experienced objectively. Then you know what it's like to be a physical object within itself, because you are a physical object within itself, and you experience the consciousness of your physical formation. Only you can agree that you are only one object. You are not all the objects of the universe. You are not even two objects of the universe. You are one physical object. And so the only subjective experience you can ever experience is what takes place within your physical object, which is your body and brain. Okay, that just has to be accepted. It's just Immanuel Kant established it in the 1700s. In previous lectures I said the 1800s, so I was wrong. He was working in the 1700s. And yeah, scientists just have to accept this. Okay, I'll leave it there. I'll make this a two-part lecture. So that was some objections, and I'll deal with more objections in another part, because I don't want this to be too long. But yeah, it is revolutionary. It is a bit shocking. It's a very significantly different way of conceptualizing your universe and what you are, basically, what you've been born out of, what you've evolved out of. Because you are this universe. You're just not all of it, but you are a subset of this conscious universe, having your conscious experience. So it takes some getting used to, just because it's not because it's illogical, not because it's unscientific, but because it's dramatically different from what we did once believe.
Okay, like putting the sun at the center of the solar system isn't unscientific, it's not illogical, it's just dramatically different from what people once believed, which was that the earth is at the center. Now you have to go from believing that the universe was dead and having no experience for 10 billion years until the formation of the earth and stuff, and then suddenly, all of a sudden, consciousness just discontinuously switches on. No, that's just incorrect. The origin, and that's why the origin of life can never be found, because the origin of life is actually at t equals 0. The universe was alive at t equals 0 when the Big Bang happened. It was conscious then. Okay, so yeah, it does take some getting your head around, but it has huge amounts of explanatory power, as I've been showing. And yeah, an important thing is it has very profound medical consequences in terms of systematizing and developing the placebo effect. So that's why I'd like, please do try and, I don't know, take it seriously and share with anyone that is interested in consciousness at all. Okay, so yeah, I'll leave it there for this first part, explaining or refuting objections. Oh yeah, and leave any other doubts or objections you have in the comments, and I'll be happy to address those as well. Okay, thanks very much for listening.